Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Dear learners, the topic of analysis is business environment and global world. Now, this lecture, which has an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspective, as we take the learnings forward in the lecture, we shall try to understand the business environment, looking at the challenges and opportunities. The aspect of business environment will be analyzed at the global level, wherein we shall discuss how changes and issues of global world impact the working of international business scenario. We shall consider points of arguments, agreements and disagreements in the debate that why today it is very significant and important to understand the global order for understanding of international business. And then most important, we shall analyze that how social, political, economic, institutional factors define the business environment of nations, which has a bearing with the global context. In the lecture, we shall also analyze the processes of globalization, its relationship with international business, looking at the ambit of trade and its implications for human resources, working of organizations, and its bearing for the operation of power for several nation states. At the outset, let's understand what do we mean by globalization. Globalization, when we try to decode the term by having a look around at our everyday surroundings, the events, the news, and so many other debates, we get a sense that it signifies intensification of cross-border interactions. With this intensification of cross-border interactions in various forms, namely trade in goods and services, there is rise of interdependence between and amongst nation states. One finds that in the global milieu, there is rise of markets that have acquired a global connotation, and therein what we find that states give up some of their powers, some of their sovereignty within this web of emergence of interconnectedness of the global scenario. So what we find in the modern international system is that global trade and finance, we have the state actors and the non-state actors like global corporations, international organizations coexisting together. Dear learners, as we take reference to this work by John Baylis and Steve Smith, the book is Globalization of World Politics, we find some important ideas, and that we state for the benefit of our learners from various disciplines, namely political science, international relations, international business, international marketing, amongst others. We find that today states have become more interdependent as well as complexly involved in a web of interactions. There is fusion of national capital markets with the global markets, and the outcome what we see here is an emergence of the integrated global economy. Dear learners, this brings us to the next concept in the topic, that is, what do we mean by global political economy? Is it different from the term international political economy? Global political economy as a field of study deals with interactions between the political and economic aspects, the forces. The traditional term, that is international political economy, both these terms, no doubt they are used interchangeably in the academic, media, policy discourse, but when we use the word global, the idea of global indicates a broad scope, a wider perspective, being taken into account. The global business environment, then what we get from this understanding of global political economy, we find that the context wherein we have the operation of global organizations, the multinational corporations, the transnational corporations, business firms rapidly expanding in realms of business activities. And therefore, while understanding this business environment from the global perspective, it is essential to see that it signifies various external forces that surround the firms and also influence the decisions and operations. An important perspective that we quote presented by Coulon and Thomas, that is, organizations face an unprecedented range of challenges and opportunities in the social, economic, business environment. So therefore, dear learners, this external environment that we are trying to situate and understand for business, namely with the global milieu, this is characterized by uncertainty, surprise, disruption, turbulence, discontinuity. And then what we see that amidst this, organizations have to situate understanding of activities of consumers, competitors, the government policies, technology developments, the society, the culture, amongst others. Another perspective that we get from Andrew Harrison, that is, when we look at the context, one has to understand that no organization, no global firm exists within a vacuum. Its strategies, its operations, namely the future perspective, range of operations, they are influenced by and they must take into account the external environment. And while understanding this external environment, one has to take into account the culture, economic, the legal apparatus, political differences between nations, countries, and all of it are being impacted as well as influencing the changing discourse at the national as well as at the global level. Let's understand that while dealing with business environment in the global perspective, what are the differences that organizations and the nation states that attempt to safeguard the interests of the business firms of their respective countries? One has to take into account that there are differences in the policy perspective. Then different countries follow varied and differentiated economic models. Then communication styles, wherein language has an impact on the working of business scenario. Then the culture, how shared beliefs, the values, the customs, the behavior, how they govern the interaction of the business, this nation state with the bigger picture of members of the society. Today, when we are trying to understand the global business environment, one also has to bring in the aspect of international trade. So when we look at the question of nations with respect to international trade, the big question then comes here is that why, for example, does a state say A, imports automobiles, buys steel, digital phones, or perhaps exports medicines from other countries? And the simple answer to that here is that no national economy produces all the goods and services that its people need. So we see that international trade as well as international relations somewhere have a common aspect, that is of geography, of national resources. That is, geography and natural endowments are varied from one country to the other. Similarly, when we discuss trade, which is about exchanging goods and services between two or more people and entities, international trade, therefore, is the concept of exchange between people or entities in two or different countries. Dear learners, why do countries trade? That's the next question. And above all, when countries are trading, what prompts them to take their trading operations towards the global scenario? Let's take into account, because the topic has an interdisciplinary perspective, let's take some ideas from the realm of economics. Absolute advantage states that a nation has an absolute advantage, namely when it is the only source of a particular product, or second, that the nation can make more of a product using the same amount of or fewer resources than other countries. When we are debating the aspect of trade and trying to understand the aspect of absolute as well as comparative advantage, within it also comes the liberal perspective, namely where the ideas of Adam Smith, that is the government non-interference, the superiority of the market exchange, and how all of it is guided by the invisible hand of the price mechanism. Dear learners, while we are trying to understand the trading milieu, let's get the ideas and understand the ideas of David Ricardo. David Ricardo gave us the perspective of comparative advantage, quoting from Ricardo's work of 1817, that is, under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor to such employments as are most beneficial to each. And this pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole. So what we see here is that related concepts which are involving trade and which are also having a bearing on the decisions of the business firm with respect to their considerations of how the global environment wherein they want to venture out, they want to work therein, that is constantly changing. We see that opportunity costs, which are, that is, the products that a country must decline to make in order to produce something else. Today's opportunity costs are influenced by global environment. The country's balance of trade, that is, when we are subtracting the value of its imports from the value of its exports. If a country sells more products than it buys, it has a favorable balance called as the trade surplus. If it buys more than it sells, it has an unfavorable balance, that is the trade deficit. Dear learners, as we are discussing the ambit of trade, the ambit of business environment and situating it within the global relations, we see that there are critiques also, namely the Marxist critique, wherein they point out that how the processes within international capitalism have inherent flaws of being biased towards those who can dominate, who can exploit, or perhaps who have better access to economic resources. An important idea while we are trying to understand global markets and how they have an impact on the working of international business, one can also take reference to Karl Polanyi's perspective. Karl Polanyi gives us an idea, an insight into the globalizing economy of the 21st century, wherein one has to sense that how markets are not just abstract entities, they're not just abstract constructs. Markets are social phenomena. They are embedded in the broader communities and above all directly connected with some deliberate forms of state action too. Dear learners, this brings us to the important aspect, that is of neoliberal ideas and the practical implications of that when we look at economic globalization. And both neoliberalism as well as economic globalization have a bearing on global business environment. Neoliberalism, the primary idea that is there must be reduction of state intervention in the economy. But global economy, global business environment, as we understand these ideas, they must be matching with the big picture, that is looking at international exchange, dynamism of economic regulation, what are the public goods and services provision, balancing fiscal and monetary policies. So therefore, the idea that David Held and others present in their book, that is globalization, therefore, is therefore not just about one idea, but what we can see is it's about set of processes which embodies a transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions. Dear learners, we have to understand that today, for globalization as well as for international business environment, there are important drivers, and all the drivers are witnessing changes in context. This is why disruption, turbulence has become like an accepted reality for international business environment. The important drivers for international business environment and globalization are markets, the government, the cost, and the competition. Now, here in which we see that how nationally based workforce production patterns today they span several jurisdictions across the world. For then to add to that, technological changes have made it possible to control the transnational production processes and bring together people from different parts of the world to add value to a specific good or service. Here in which brings the important question and an important insight, and then why firms go global? What are the incentives that drive firms to go global? Herein we see that when we decode the working of multinational and transnational companies, we find that there is a quest of an increased customer base, increasing their sales turnover by expanding internationally, international brand recognition, working out initiatives to focus on global marketing strategies, the quest to spread risk, diversify risk, avoiding protectionist policies of one country and thereby moving to the other, factoring in working out cheaper production cost, working out of benefits from inexpensive labor, and to gain from host countries' infrastructure. Then one can also not ignore that how today even respective individual nation states offer financial incentives, like how host countries' government help countries to reduce the production cost, which also allows multinational corporations, global firms to expand. Then this expansion works in the form of investments. Let's decode the typology here. The foreign direct investment is where an individual or a business from one nation invests in the other. It can be a varied formed. Let's read that. Horizontal FDI is where funds are invested abroad in the same industry. Vertical FDI, where an investment is made within the supply chain but not directly in the same industry. Conglomerate FDI is where an investment is made in a completely different industry. Dear learners, from this we also have to distinguish between FDI and FII. The foreign direct investment implies to invest in a foreign company and to acquire controlling ownership in the company. Foreign institutional investment is about investing in the foreign stock market. Now we see that how today MNCs with their global approach are also becoming an important tool of diplomacy. We all know that how Japan and United States were at loggerheads during the last phase of the end of the Second World War. But today, the world scenario has changed. We find Japanese motor vehicle manufacturers, to name some, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, that have set up factories in European Union and North America, and vice versa, American firms and European firms having a huge presence in Japanese market. So we see that how multinational corporation, they have become an important anchor of the world economy. MNC, for the purpose of clarification, is an organization that operates in 2 or more countries. Now it's important to note that both MNC and TNC, they have foreign affiliates, they operate around the world. But in terms of the structure and composition, we see that the difference between multinational and transnational enterprise is that MNCs have centralized management system which somehow cannot be seen in terms of a transnational enterprise. Dear learners, as we are factoring in the perspective from the global business environment, we see that how today global firms like MNCs and TNCs, they offer huge advantages, namely in terms of adding to the state exchequer, integrating the global economy with the local economy, helping countries to develop competitive business models. Then today, with global governance becoming dynamic, the threats, the risk, the gains cutting across the borders of the state, the public and the private complementing each other. Today we have several examples at how in terms of crisis, from economic crisis to humanitarian crisis to environmental crisis, the work of global corporations is going hand in hand with the states, and how today global issues like economic crisis, humanitarian crisis, ecological crisis, they go beyond the control of states. With the period of industrial revolution, one finds that how the model of operating of global firms was like English and the Dutch companies, and the critics argued that it was about colonizing for their economic needs. But today, when we see changes in the working pattern of organizations with the context that is disintegration of Soviet Union, the open world, spread of companies, existing MNCs and global firms in the 21st centuries are expanding their markets, technological advancements amongst others. When we look at ecology, today how governments need MNC supports with respect to the electrical and gas industries to stop their greenhouse emission. When we look at humanitarian perspective, governments need MNC support to factor in corporate social responsibility. When we look at global relations, how government need global firm support, for example, American-Japanese relations, to build up alliances and to strengthen relations. So the role of business in global governance has become important, and vice versa, global governance impacts global business environment. Transnational business associations are progressively more visible. Important stakeholders in international policy debates and in governmental institutions are being seen in the form of global firms. Attention is being given to global policy in national and international communities. Research is also ongoing to understand the multiple modes of engagement between business and global governance. So today, as we see the reference, that is Business and Global Governance, the book edited by Morton Coart and Leander from Routledge, that is business, whether it is a master and purpose of global governance, business, whether do we pursue it as subject and opponent of global governance, business as a partner or facilitator of global governance. One must refer to this work to get some more interesting insights into global business and the global environment. Then further, some interesting deliberations presented by Robert Gross in the work International Business and Global Relations, 2005, Cambridge University Press. How the book points out that ideas, perspectives of the company's decision maker considered with national regulation to the host government, the policy maker in the emerging market, to the home government policy maker in a triad country. How all of it today is a part of the state-market interaction, which also has a bearing on both global relations, global governance, as well as international business environment. Globalization of business is bound to affect all nations. Today, there is an unprecedented impact. Business has spanned across the globe in a huge manner. With globalization of world commerce, it is essential to understand global issues, and therefore what we see that with the complexity, overlapping of issues, the context of global business is constantly expanding, and there is a need to understand that with the new challenges like protectionism, debates on merits of globalization, issues of tariffs, quotas, export controls, trade sanctions, currency manipulation, and other non-tariff measures on trade, globalization, competition, consumer welfare, how in all of it we are witnessing an increasingly complex world. Working, engaging, navigating with it requires creativity, innovation, and therefore there is a need for a comparative study, multidisciplinary approach to discover innovative ways of both managing organization structure, finances, people, strategy, as well as factoring in the changing global realities with respect to the changing context. Dear learners, we hope you all gained significant insights into the aspect of global business and its relation and a significant bearing with global relations. Thank you for being with us for the lecture.